This is Mrs. Sturgeon, and we are going to be talking about how to graph lines or linear functions in slope-intercept form. So let's jump right in. Okay, up here at the top, it talks about slope-intercept form of a linear equation, and basically we are just going to write the general format and the way that you'll probably hear it referenced throughout high school. Y equals mx plus b, where the m stands for something specific and the b stands for something specific. So let's talk about what those mean. M represents the slope of the equation, so we're talking rise over run, and b represents the y-intercept. Okay, so m represents the slope, b represents the y-intercept, and we are going to talk about how do you take an equation, figure out what is the slope, what is the y-intercept, and then actually put it on the graph. So for some of these questions down here, I highlighted a few. We won't do every single one of them. Let's talk about how to find the slope and how to find the y-intercept. Knowing that m represents the slope, m in y equals mx plus b is right next to the x. Okay, there's no symbols happening between the m and the x. They're just right next to each other. They're like married, if you want to think of it that way. So since it's the one that's right next to x, in order to figure out the slope of an equation, locate where x is. So in our case, it's right here. The number that's in front of the x is 3. So that's going to be considered our slope. Okay, then the y-intercept is basically the other number, right? The one that's being added or subtracted after that x variable. Okay, so in our equation here, I'll highlight it in green, we've got a -1. So your y-intercept is going to be -1 here. So for this next example, again, we're looking for the number that's in front of the x to represent the slope. So let's locate the x. Here it is. The number in front of it is 4 over 7, 4/7. So that's our slope. Okay, and then our y-intercept is basically just the other number. So we have a +2 over here. Then that means our y-intercept is a +2. Perfect. Now, the other example I've highlighted. Again, the slope, pretty straightforward. When you have a number in front of the x, that's your slope, so 2/3. All right, so our slope is 2/3. Now here's the problem. We said, okay, if there's a number being added or subtracted, then that's going to be our y-intercept. So you might notice for this example, there is no number being added or subtracted. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no y-intercept. That means the y-intercept is the number that means nothing. Right? There's nothing there. The number that means nothing is 0. So my y-intercept is 0 for this problem. Okay? Now let's talk about how to get this on the graph. Okay, so we already talked about how to identify the slope and the y-intercept. So that's the first thing that you're going to do. You're just going to start by identifying what is the slope. Let's talk step 1. So step 1, we're going to just look at the equation and verify that we're actually in slope-intercept form. Okay, so again, we're looking for that y equals mx plus b format, okay? And if you look at the actual example itself, it looks just like that. So there's no need to panic. We're in slope-intercept form. We're good to go. Next, we're going to go through and identify what is the slope and what is the y-intercept. So for our example, the slope, again, number in front of the x, is 2/3. So I'm just going to write up here, note to myself, m equals 2/3. And m, I'm using m because that's the kind of universal math variable that we use to describe slope. So 2/3. Now the b, our y-intercept, is -2. Okay, so I've identified the slope and the y-intercept. Next, we need to graph them. So we will start with the y-intercept. The y-intercept happens on the y-axis. So I'm going to identify the y-axis. That's the one that goes vertically or up and down. So that's this right here. X-axis is over here. Now, it says -2. So starting at 0, I count down 2. This is my y-intercept. So 0, -2 is the actual specific point. But again, we can think of it as find the y-axis, go down 2 from the origin. Got it. Now, as far as plotting the slope goes, here's what we do. From the y-intercept, I'm going to count up 2 units because it's a positive slope, and then I'm going to go right 3 units and plot a point. Okay, so again, I went up 2 units because we're going in a positive slope direction, and right 3 units to plot my next point. After that, connect the dots, and that's your graph. If you'd like to continue putting more, go up 2 over 3, so on and so forth. As many dots as you want, following the same pattern. And that's my line. Let's do one more example. So in this equation, notice that the x is not where it normally is. The x has usually been written as the first term, and then the number is the second term. So since this is flipped around, it's a little more confusing looking, but it doesn't change the fact that the slope is always associated with the x. So in front of the x, I don't have any numbers. We automatically assume that means it's 1, okay, and it's a negative sign, so the slope is going to be -1. Okay, the number that we didn't use yet is +4, so that's my y-intercept. All right, so start by plotting my y-intercept. So I'm going to go on the y-axis, up 1, 2, 3, 4, put a dot. And then my slope is -1, so from there, since it's negative, instead this time I'm going to go down 1 to the right 1. And that's where my next dot will be. So again, down 1, right 1, because of the fact that this is a negative slope. Okay, and that's how you graph lines in slope-intercept form.